Competition, Antitrust, and Foreign Investment Group. From Vietnam, we have Christopher Balding, Associate Professor from the Fulbright University in Vietnam, and Omar Wakil, Partner at Torys LLP. Each witness will present for 7 minutes, followed by rounds of questions. With that, we will start with Mr. Balsillie. You have the floor for 7 minutes.
Madam Chair, honorable members, thank you for the opportunity to present today. I am Jim Balsillie, Chair of the Council of Canadian Innovators. I welcome the committee study on the Investment Canada Act because it's a critical regulatory tool for ensuring Canada's prosperity and security. In the modern knowledge-based and data-driven economy, the sources of prosperity and the vectors of risk have changed. The Act must therefore change as well to ensure it remains fit for purpose. Specifically, 1. The understanding of foreign direct investment that informs the construction of the Act is based on investment in tangible production. It does not reflect the contemporary economy where the most valuable national economic and security assets are intellectual property and data. Number 2, the Act is based on the premise that with FDI, the direction of the flow of knowledge and technology is into Canada. This used to be the case with FDI into industrial production. It is not the case with FDI into the innovation economy, where FDI is extractive. Number 3, the concept of net benefit or risk could be reasonably applied in the industrial economy based on the size of the acquired business assets. In the knowledge-based and data-driven economy, prosperity and risk do not scale with size, but with spillovers. Canadian policy remains firmly grounded in industrial-era concepts, failing to develop national strategies for IP or for data. The companies and countries now compete by owning and controlling intangible assets. The EU is building its own cloud, not because Europeans lack faith in the multilateral trading system, but because EU policymakers understand that whoever owns the IP and whoever controls the data controls who and what interacts with it, and this has major implications for their prosperity, security, and democracy. Canada is on the sidelines in the global competition for IP and data, contributing to their creation, but not contesting their ownership and ensuing benefits. Consequently, we see the exfiltration of knowledge assets out of Canada on a regular basis, across borders with the stroke of a pen, currently without any national security or economic review. For example, foundational IP for AI that Canadian taxpayers funded for 2 decades is transferred from the University of Toronto to Google. Also, Huawei creates 17 research partnerships with Canadian universities for equally valuable telecom infrastructure. There are many other examples. Meanwhile, smart countries like Germany, with its 72 Fraunhofer institutes, has only one central exploitation department, which administers and manages IP applications, exploitations, and contracts on an expert basis. Germany, UK, US, France, and even the EU created update FDI strategies, while Canada has not. Germany went as far as blocking the hiring of one of its computer engineers, a recognition by policymakers that the negative spillovers for Germany outweigh the private returns of the computer engineer. IP and data have strong public good characteristics, so private decisions do not price the associated externalities or spillovers into their contractual agreements. 3 aspects of the current ICA study are particularly noteworthy as inappropriate for today's economy. Number 1, the valuation thresholds. Number 2, a moratorium narrowly focused on acquisitions from state-owned enterprises of authoritarian countries. And number 3, a principal economic focus on jobs. Very few strategic transactions would require review based on these criteria, and they don't guide the attention of policymakers administering the Act to the issues relevant in the contemporary economy. The focus on acquisitions from SOEs of authoritarian countries is insufficient because if the assets are critical to Canada's prosperity, security, and sovereignty, then we need to ensure they remain in our control regardless of the foreign counterparty. Finally, there are many other economic consequences beyond jobs that must be considered, especially since the key skills for the IP and data-driven economy are in short supply. Instead, we need to ask the following questions. where does the value proposition in our economy lie? How is the value we generate connected to our prosperity and security? Is the Act structured to guide an informed assessment of a given investment into the innovation, knowledge-based, and data-driven economy? Our current approach to dealing with Canada's most valuable economic and national security assets is akin to putting an additional bolt lock on the front door while advertising our screen door on the side is open. In my attached appendix, I proposed an updated analytical framework for the ICA. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next round witness is Mr. Wakil. You have the floor for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for asking me to appear before the committee. I'm delighted to be here. Let me begin my remarks by saying that I think the present foreign investment review regime works well in connection with its review of acquisitions of Canadian businesses. I do not think it's necessary to lower Investment Canada Act review thresholds. I do not think it's necessary or desirable to place a temporary moratorium on acquisitions by state-owned enterprises. In my view, the Act and the government's current enforcement practices already provide sufficient means to address foreign investment concerns, even during the COVID-19 crisis. There are a number of reasons for this. First, in terms of process, the government already has broad powers to review virtually any acquisition of any Canadian business. In particular, all foreign investors are subject to potential national security reviews, regardless of the value of the Canadian business, and so regardless of whether the business has been devalued as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Moreover, investors that are SOEs are also subject to net benefit reviews that are based on thresholds that are much lower than the thresholds for private sector investors. Importantly, the special low threshold for state-owned enterprise investors is based on the book value of the Canadian business's assets. In many cases, temporary devaluations as a result of the COVID-19 crisis should not affect whether or not a review is required. Second, in terms of substance, the government already has broad enforcement powers to protect Canadian interests and to do so on a case-by-case basis. In the case of national security reviews, the government can take, and I quote from the legislation, any measures considered advisable to protect national security, end quote. That includes blocking a deal, requiring a divestiture, or imposing any conditions whatsoever on the investment. In the case of SOE investments, there are also special requirements that SOE investors must meet in order to secure a net benefit approval. SOE investors must agree to adhere to Canadian standards of corporate governance, and they must operate the Canadian business on a commercial basis. These commitments are perpetual. They apply for the lifetime of the investment, and they're actively monitored by the government. In other words, there's a special rigor and scrutiny applied to state-owned enterprise investments to ensure that they operate in the same way as private actors. In my view, it's highly preferable to continue to review investments in a nuanced and fact-specific way rather than having some sort of blanket ban. With the case-by-case approach, investments that are problematic can be blocked or restructured. Investments that are not problematic can be approved to proceed. There would also be at least 3 substantial practical risks and hurdles to lowering review thresholds or imposing a moratorium on certain investments. First, as a general matter, lower thresholds or a moratorium may deter the injections of capital that foreign investment can bring. That could impede our economic reopening and harm Canadians. For example, the alternative for some distressed businesses may not be the status quo, or it may not be acquisitions by Canadian buyers. It may be insolvency. Second, an across-the-board moratorium may be controversial to implement. Labeling certain countries as authoritarian could exacerbate existing diplomatic tensions or create new ones. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, there may be complex legal impediments to changing the Investment Canada Act's net benefit thresholds. That's because certain free trade agreements, such as the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, have carve-outs for the current thresholds that were negotiated terms of those agreements. In other words, I believe that at least some of our trade agreements may have the effect of requiring the government to maintain the current net benefit thresholds. So a potential amendment to the Investment Canada Act in this regard may have unintended knock-on effects that would have to be carefully considered. In sum, I believe the current regime is well calibrated to capture and deal with potentially problematic acquisitions of Canadian businesses. That's not to say there's no room for improvement. Incremental changes to the Investment Canada Act regime and its administration could be desirable. However, I see these steps as ones that are desirable in the long term and not urgently needed to address the COVID-19 crisis. To name a few, the government should ensure that the Investment Review Division and its sister agencies receive adequate funding to ensure net benefit and national security reviews are conducted with speed and efficiency. Second, there may be merit in providing additional case-specific guidance on national security reviews. Third, there may be merit in requiring or permitting investors to file notification forms where there are acquisitions of material minority interests, not where there are acquisitions of control, or, as Mr. Basile has said, to give the government broader jurisdiction over transactions that do not involve acquisitions of control or acquisitions of ownership interests in Canadian companies. And with that, I conclude my remarks. I'm pleased to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And our next witness is Blake Castles and Graydon. You have the floor for 7 minutes. You're still on mute.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and honorable members. I'm grateful to be here and present evidence this morning. I am appearing on behalf of myself and my partner, Brian Facey, who's the chair of the Competition, Antitrust and Foreign Investment Group at Blake's, but who is unable to be with us this morning. We regularly provide advice to both foreign investors and Canadian businesses regarding all aspects of the Investment Canada Act. We are also the co-authors of Investment Canada Act Commentary and Annotation 2020, which is published annually by legal publisher LexisNexis. That book is in its 8th year of publication and is widely used by lawyers, Canadian businesses, and foreign investors considering the applications of the ICA to investments in Canada. I'm presenting in my personal capacity, and the views expressed do not represent those of Blake's or its clients. I'll begin by providing an overview of the issues raised by the committee, followed by 3 recommendations for your consideration based on our experience. In short, we believe the Investment Canada Act and the review mechanisms do not require amendment, and no blanket policies or amendments should be adopted at this time. The ICA works as framework legislation, which provides broad discretion to the minister to approve, reject, or amend foreign investments on a case-by-case basis. While we do believe this is a priority area and that it is critical at this time in particular that the investment review branch be sufficiently staffed and funded to be able to carry out its important mandate. The challenges faced by businesses and government arising from the COVID-19 crisis are indeed unprecedented. And while we acknowledge the potential risks associated with foreign takeovers of Canadian businesses critical to national security, the ICA already gives extensive powers to the government to conduct in-depth reviews of foreign investments and block or remedy any investment that raises a national security concern. Reviews can, and they frequently do, take upwards of 200 days to complete. But based on our experience and observation over the last several months, a blanket prohibition on investments by certain categories of investor or regarding certain industries is not warranted, and a case-by-case approach is appropriate. Imposing additional obligations on investors, especially without conferring additional resources to the IRB and its partner agencies and providing for additional transparency measures, could signal to the investment community that that investors are likely to face additional red tape when trying to invest in Canada. Canada needs foreign direct investment to support a strong economic recovery. It's also important to keep in mind that Parliament made significant changes in 2009 to implement measures to protect national security. But at the same time, it also took steps in 2015 to increase the monetary thresholds and reduce the number of economic or net benefit reviews. These changes achieved an appropriate balance between encouraging investment from our trading partners while making sure that Canadian intellectual property and manufacturing capacity did not fall into the hands of investors whose intentions may not be in the best interests of Canadians. Lowering the review thresholds would be moving backwards in terms of opening Canada up to much needed foreign direct investment. So I'll now turn quickly to the recommendations that we propose. Currently, the ICA does not require that investors give notice to the government before closing unless the investment involves the direct takeover of a Canadian business whose value exceeds the applicable financial threshold. However, it is common practice for investors to notify the government before closing when an investment has potential national security implications. In our view, this practice works well, but if changes are to be considered, they should only be in connection with investments in industries critical to Canadian national security. And trade agreement investors should also be exempted from a mandatory notification requirement before closing. And the list of critical industries should be precise so that investors and Canadian businesses can easily ascertain whether a filing is required or not. Moreover, the government should not add to the already lengthy 200-day timeline for national security reviews. The investment review branch needs to have the resources and directives to triage cases quickly, and let me turn to that. We've also observed that when investments are under review, particularly on national security matters, the timelines can be quite long. And this is especially problematic where investors plan to establish new businesses in Canada that create jobs, conduct new research, and develop products and services for the benefit of the Canadian economy. A permanent director of investments should be appointed soon, and the government should add more technical staff to the review teams that have the expertise to more quickly assess when investments raise or don't raise national security concerns. Finally, we also encourage this committee to take steps to improve transparency during the review process. In our experience, investors are often left wondering why their investments get caught up in a national security review. And during that process, investors are told very little about the concerns and the steps that might be needed to address them. A robust national security review framework is in the interest of all Canadians, but that framework must be applied in a principled and transparent way. Investors should have the ability to meaningfully respond to concerns that have been raised, and that process should be built into the law and the regulations. We thank you for the opportunity to address this committee on this very important topic related to Canada's economic future, and I would be pleased to address any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. And we'll now move to Professor Balding. You have the floor for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And once again, I apologize for the problems with the microphone. And I would also like to state at the outset that while I am not an expert on Canadian investment law, I believe I have the necessary expertise to speak on the threat of state-owned investment. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, for giving me this opportunity to talk with you today on a topic that I believe is of great importance in the world today. I say this as an economist and as a citizen of a democratic country concerned about the influence of authoritarian states across a variety of sectors. By intellectual belief, barriers to trade, investment, and the free flow of labor are an anathema to me. I've spent most of my career working in Asia and teaching at universities promoting these ideals and values. I believe open and liberal democracies benefit from their openness. However, after working for 9 years at Peking University HSBC Business School in China as a public employee, I was mugged by the reality of modern China and strong-armed authoritarianism. Modern China under Chairman Xi stands in stark opposition to the values Canada as an open liberal democracy holds dear. How do we balance the demands of open markets with the very real threat of predatory subsidized state-owned enterprises? To answer this question, we must first answer the question about the threat posed by expansionary, authoritarian controlled state-owned enterprises. These are companies that are using public funds to target strategic enterprises and control key resources, assets, or technology. In China, we see many examples of state-owned or linked companies receiving enormous state largesse to help them expand abroad, whether that is providing vendor financing that would not be allowed under OECD rules, state-backed finance to make acquisitions, or industries targeted by political leaders. State-owned and linked enterprises from authoritarian states receive significant benefits private enterprise in the rest of the world do not receive. They also target assets, whether in natural resources or technology, that are prioritized by political leaders rather than market forces. We have seen examples where China buys foreign technology companies and attempts to move the entire operation back to China. This is not the behavior of a market force behavior or even a trustworthy counterparty. Arguably more worryingly, we have seen examples where China tries different methods to avoid scrutiny of its investment activity and uses a variety of measures to disguise their activity, whether it is third-party investment via various funds, or whether it is failure to submit foreign investments for regulatory scrutiny, which later require forced divestment. In other examples, they have offered enticements to strike deals, opening the Chinese market if technology is transferred to them. We have evidence that China keeps detailed records about intellectual property held by firms with a range of related information that value the asset. It is clear China has a targeted list with a hierarchy of technologies and intellectual property assets. All of these behaviors raise valid concerns about the authoritarian Chinese state as a trustworthy counterparty in international investment. Given the clear risks we see associated with investment from China, I believe it is in the best interest of Canada to seriously think about the risks associated with a country which has demonstrated a clear pattern of threatening and predatory investment behavior. I'd be willing to take questions from the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we will move to our round of questions. For our 6-minute round, our first round of questions come from MP Gray. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to everyone for being here today. My questions will be for Professor Balding to start. Some foreign policy experts have written about concerns regarding the Chinese state's strategy to dominate through the acquisition of large companies in other countries. And I wanted to see if you agree with this assessment, Professor Balding.
I would take a slightly more nuanced view, but agree in, say, general terms. The general priorities that are set by China are laid down relatively regularly annually by top leadership, and they have very clear industrial targets. And with the foreign exchange rationing that is effectively going on in China, when firms are going out abroad, they are either raising that capital outside of the Chinese market so that it's in hard currency, or that is currency that is being allocated to them by the state, by SAFE, the FX regulator in China, which controls US dollars. So they basically have a list of industrial targets, sectoral targets around the world, so that the key state-owned enterprises or major state-linked companies in China have their list of what their shopping list, for lack of a better term. And so I think it's a little more nuanced than that, but they definitely have a clear list of targets around the world that they are essentially looking for, whether that is in technology or natural resources.
Okay, thank you. And I think that actually leads into my next question here, where some experts have also said that the goal of these takeovers is not about profit, but about expanding their international influence. And so, Professor Balding, first, do you agree with this? And if so, what detriments could this have on the Canadian economy if these foreign takeovers aren't considering economic well-being?
So I think it's very fair to say that a lot of these investments are made much more for influential purposes or for Chinese state strategic purposes. For instance, there is a UK semiconductor company that was sold to a Chinese conglomerate. And part of the agreement was that it would remain in Britain. And there's currently a national security fight as basically the Chinese are seeking to move the entire company out of Britain and effectively leave little or no staff in Britain. So it's not just influence, but there's clearly influence targeting. But there's also very strategic. Does this meet the China strategic goal, in this specific case, China 2025, and their desire to upgrade semiconductor manufacturing output? But there are also, it's also very important to note what you referred to as influence. Many examples in the investment world like that as well. Basically, they seem to be less about economic and financial returns and much more about state policy.
Okay, thank you. If a review right now is triggered through the current Investment Canada Act, there needs to be a proven net benefit to Canada. And so, Professor Balding, do you feel that the parameters that are currently laid out listed are sufficient to show net benefit?
With the caveat, I am not an expert on Canadian investment law or exactly how net benefit has been defined over time in Canada. I think it would be well worth looking at that closer and exactly the requirements that are placed on foreign acquirers, because there are many examples where Chinese companies have behaved in a manner that they clearly not only would not necessarily follow an agreement after an acquisition was approved, but that they would move companies in different ways and reassign assets that would not be in the best interest of Canada.
Okay. So we've seen some examples of the Chinese state-owned enterprise, China Communications Construction Company, building globally, such as the Malta Dry Dock in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor infrastructure, Sri Lanka Port City. Many academics call this the debt trap diplomacy. And so how do you see this playing out, and is this something that we should be concerned with here in Canada?
I think it's less of two specific issues that you raise. I think it's likely less of an issue for Canada because they are not necessarily, Chinese lenders are not necessarily lending significantly that I am aware of in any appreciable amount to either Chinese local governments or major Canadian industrial firms. The other thing that I think is noticeable about China is that there was probably less thinking about this. So I doubt that there was, say, a debt trap plan concocted in Beijing, and simply more that they were under orders to go out and lend to companies abroad in targeted countries along the Belt and Road.
Okay, thank you. And I think our time is up there, Madam Chair.
Unfortunately, yes. Our next round of questions goes to MP Erskine Smith. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. And before I get to the witnesses, the clerk did circulate a notice of motion. I just want to make sure that it is a matter of public record today. And so I'll move it on Thursday, but just so everyone is on the same page, the motion is that pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2, the Standing Committee on Innovation, Science and Technology invites senior representatives from Loblaw Companies Limited, Metro Inc., and Empire Company Limited, which owns Sobeys, to explain their decisions to cancel on the same day the modest increase in wages for frontline grocery store workers during the pandemic, including how those decisions are consistent with our competition laws. And I know a number of us were quite frustrated to see that decision taking place, and I think it's important on behalf of Canadians that we have these companies in to explain themselves. Hopefully they don't talk to one another first. Now, my question on the Investment Canada Act is the same for all the witnesses. And we heard previous testimony to the effect that the policy guidance in mid-April that was issued by the minister's office effectively says there's going to be greater scrutiny on state-owned or companies that are associated with authoritarian regimes, and so there will be there is currently additional scrutiny should those acquisitions be proposed. We heard some witness testimony though that rather than that policy direction, there ought to be firmer guidance with greater specificity. And out of all of the witness testimony, that seems to be a recommendation that is reasonable. And I wonder, starting with Mr. Wakil, if that's something that you would think we ought to support.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It is something that I think we should support. I should say, by way of additional background, that I think the government has over the years done a good job in trying to increase the transparency around national security reviews under the Investment Canada Act. The annual report that the Investment Review Division issues is a valuable source of information to members of the bar and to foreign investors and Canadian businesses seeking foreign investment with respect to statistical information about the types of national securities that have been undertaken, the outcomes of the reviews, the remedies, the timelines. There are also guidelines on national security reviews that are also helpful. Where I think, but as I said in my opening remarks, I do think additional guidance would be necessary. Investors in Canadian businesses don't mind having rules, but they like to have as much certainty about the rules as possible. And where I think additional guidelines and guidance rather may be helpful is case-specific guidance to the extent that that's possible. Now, sometimes these national security reviews, by their very nature, inhibit the disclosure of information that may be valuable. But I think there is additional guidance that the government could give as it obtains additional experience with national security reviews in case-specific situations. More information about the industry that was of interest to the government, more information about the outcomes of the review.
And Mr. Crane?
Thank you very much. I agree with Mr. Wakil that the government has done a good job increasing transparency, particularly through the annual report. In my experience, however, investors are told very little about what a specific national security concern their investments raise, and they're not actually told anything until the 90th day of a review. And even then, they're just given a summary statement of a couple of sentences at a pretty generic level and then asked to make representations or respond. And there's no formal process by which investors are given a thorough explanation of the national security concern, nor are they given specific guidance necessarily about the types of measures that they could take to address those concerns.
So then, knowing that businesses, as Mr. Wakil says, business depends upon certainty for investment. Right. And so ensuring that the policy direction, which I think is the right policy direction as far as it goes, that was issued in mid-April, ensuring that they are translated into more fulsome guidelines with greater specificity, that is something that you would support. Absolutely. And even during the case-specific process, additional transparency measures would help so that the investors know whether, the outcome is looking promising or the outcome is just not going to work in their favor. And to drag investors through a 200-day process only to tell them, I'm sorry, but we can't work things out, doesn't necessarily send the best message to the investment community. And Jim, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I'll just echo what I said in my comments. We have a decades outdated framework for this that doesn't bear any relationship to the economic and security structures of the contemporary economy. And every thoughtful nation has long updated their approaches to this. And even the US right now is going through 8 distinct and broad sectors to list the various technologies and companies and how they're going to review it. And so no, we're woefully out of date, and our framework does not apply to the issues at hand for the contemporary economy.
I see our chair has put up the yellow card, and so as I run out of time, I love all of my colleagues, but Bobby Morrissey, I miss you most of all, so it's good to see you on the line.
Thank you very much. Notre prochain tour, c'est...
On the next round, Mr. Savard-Tremblay, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question would be for Mr. Balding. You've drawn a picture of particularly the Chinese presence and its power surge, as it were, looking to take advantage of certain shortcomings or gaps. When we look at the Chinese model, well, it's a market economy model, but they're colluding between major consortia of enterprise and the government itself. So there's a form of collusion with industrial groups coming out of these industrial liberal democracies. They'll collude with foreign companies in their own country. So I think it's probably a question of dependence on China. Look, we just learned how dependent we are from a medical point of view and a pharmaceutical point of view with this pandemic. They can't collude if they have no one to collude with. So what do you say to that?
There's a lot of truth to that. For instance, a lot of in key sectors, what you will frequently see is you will see the CEO of, for instance, the first China Telecom will become the CEO of China Unicom, will become the CEO of the next Chinese telecom company. So they're really all one company, and so that's one of the things that I think is very important to note is that a lot of times, especially really a company of any size from China. If they are investing in Canada with any significant amount of money, they clearly have the state blessing, and they probably have they've been provided funds from Chinese banks in different ways and access to foreign capital. So when you talk about that level of state and enterprise collusion was the translated word that I received. I think that's a relatively accurate statement that there's this marriage between business and the state, and that's why I said earlier that they are essentially given industries that they need to go out, and if they are investing abroad, there's a certain list of industries that they're supposed to be investing in.
So the question is what to do if we witness this, even if China is a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Its behavior puts the lie to their membership in the WTO. So what do? It's all well to have relations between Canada and China, for example. They had been quite warm a few years ago, and there would have possibility of establishing a trade deal between Canada and China. Today, it's just terrible. There's no possible way. However, we still maintain a certain relationship. So how do we get out of this?
I think the basic question is if we're focusing on investment into Canada is basically what do we think of as national security? And I think this is a question that countries around the world, especially in the light of the COVID, are re-examining right now. Even 6 months ago, if somebody would have said, basic medical equipment like PPE would have been considered national security, nobody would have taken that person seriously. Now that is front and center at everyone's thoughts. So I think one of the first things that we have to think about, and I noticed that today we're on Zoom. Zoom basically is a Chinese company. All of their encryption, everything goes through China right now. Now this video is going to be made public, is my understanding. But if it was to be preferred to be private or secure in some way, this could cause real problems for the Canadian government. So I think one of the things is, and I would agree with some of the other witnesses that have spoken about, there needs to be, and there's a double-edged sword here. There needs to be transparency as to the rules and what the procedure is. It also needs to be noted that China uses that transparency against governments like Canada and has taken steps to make sure that its investments avoid scrutiny or regulatory detection. And then after they're forced to divest or something like that, they already have the necessary data or IP to go off and make their own product. So there needs to be that balance struck between the necessary transparency that I agree with the other witnesses on and keeping certain information confidential for the government.
Okay, I've just got the yellow ticket, so my timing is over. So you were very evocative in your presentations, and we're avoiding this threat from the Chinese flag. We're using a Chinese application to meet. That's rather ironic, don't you think?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Goes to MP Massé. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And real briefly, but importantly, I want to thank Mr. Erskine-Smith for bringing that motion forth. I'll be supporting that motion. It's unreal that during a time when grocery stores and our system of monopolization has resulted in significant revenues for them, that this would take place. And I'm hoping we can do a further analysis with regards to a riding where mine, where there is disproportionate service that is reduced from poorer and more challenged areas versus more economically advantaged areas, are also reflected in staffing, consumer supports, pricing, the way the facility looks, and it's actually overall business plan for the area. In fact, some areas are not even serviced because of their challenges by some of these chains. So I think we can hopefully have a good discussion about that, because nutrition is important for quality, and there's a systemic problem of discrimination among these chains to some of the services they're providing in certain neighborhoods. With that, my first question will be for Mr. Wakil and Mr. Crane. With regards to keeping the status quo, for the most part, is what you're advocating for it. So what in specific has Canada gotten right that other countries are doing wrong? Because an analysis of this shows that we're different. And what tangible results and specific statistics can you point to that's economically advantaged ourselves, either through creation of new products and services or GDP from this type of system that we have that is different than other countries? Maybe Mr. Crane first and then Mr. Wakil.
Sure, thank you very much, Mr. Massey. You know, we've had a national security process in place now for about 11 years, and the process has actually worked quite well. The government has issued repeated guidance to investors to come in early when they have transactions that raise national security concerns. And for the most part, investors have heeded that guidance.
So do you have, I'm sorry to interrupt, statistical information to back that up? That is what I'm looking for.
I've been told that more than half of investments are pre-notified before closing. But that's a figure you should try to obtain from the investment review branch, because they track that information. It's not available publicly, but they would have that information if you require it. The other thing to note too is that Canada receives notice of about 1,000 investments every year, and only a handful of those investments are ultimately reviewed on national security grounds, which shows that the vast majority of foreign direct investments into Canada are not subject to national security review, and only a handful are, which suggests to me that either investors are being prudent about the types of investments that they are making, or the government has accurately identified the types of investments that raise national security issues.
Okay, I'm sorry, that wasn't really what I was looking for, but Mr. Wakil, maybe you can take a shot at that. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful, Mr. Crane. I was talking about what Canada was doing different versus that of other countries, and how the net benefit really should have shown statistically for either investments or actually opportunities. Mr. Wakil, can you take a shot at that, please?
I'll try to take a shot at it, sure. And I think, my first response is that Canada is highly unusual compared to other jurisdictions in having an economic net benefit type of review for foreign investment. The vast
My
majority.
apologies, Mr. Wakehill. Could you put the microphone a little closer, please? Thank
Pardon
you.
me. I'm sorry. Hopefully you can hear me now more clearly. First, I would start by saying that Canada is highly unusual in my experience in having a net benefit, economic benefit review for foreign investments. The vast majority of countries either have national security reviews of foreign investments or no review of foreign investment whatsoever. So Canada, along with Australia and a handful of other jurisdictions, is in a highly unusual and small group of countries that review certain inbound investments for benefit. Secondly, with respect to your specific question, you're asking for information that, to my knowledge, has not been collected or analyzed by the government, but that would be very difficult or challenging to do. And part of the reason why it would be challenging to provide you with an answer to that, that is to say, the benefit of the net benefit regime, is that we don't know the but-for scenario. We don't know what would have happened to that Canadian business if the foreign investment hadn't happened. And I can tell you from personal experience, anecdotally, however, there are a lot of investments that have worked out very well. There are a lot of investments where, as I said in my opening remarks, the alternative to the investment was insolvency, and the foreign investment, the injection of foreign expertise, the injection of foreign capital helped the Canadian business and saved jobs.
No, that's no, thank you. And I need to move on. I'm sorry, Mr. Wakehill, because I want to go to Mr. Balsillie. And I do appreciate that. And that's a fair assessment of what I'm asking for. But it's just that when we hear about keeping the status quo, it's often, arguments that really don't have any evidence as well. They're not empirically analyzed, and it's often we hear the fear of change argument either being violation of trade agreements and so forth. And really quickly to Mr. Balsillie, you only have a few seconds. Is there something that Canada can do in terms of low-hanging fruit right away to at least ebb the tide of the exodus of some of the critical foreign companies that are smaller right now?
Yeah, absolutely. You need to have an updated framework that factors the nature of the spillovers and the consequences in a cross-cutting fashion of the contemporary economy. And we don't use that right now. So when you calculate benefit, you don't calculate it properly. You calculate it with an anachronistic approach.
Thank you very much. And we'll now move to round two of our questions. And our first round goes to MP Dreeshen. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and hopefully my internet connection stays hooked up. Both Mr. Balsillie and Professor Balding, the rest of the world seems to understand the importance of what is happening as far as IP is concerned. Perhaps after Wednesday's UN security vote, we can get back to focusing on Canadian jobs and giving proper attention to the policies for Canadians. And certainly, Professor Balding, you mentioned in a tweet, and I'll quote it, Beijing has made it clear for some time it wants to do away with the liberal international order. Continued multilateral steps towards openness and respect for human rights are dead if you accept the Chinese vision. So as someone with intimate knowledge of the Chinese government and their economy, I wonder if you could put this into context in terms of our study on the Investment Canada Act. We've heard testimony, for example, that suggests Canada needs to clarify its foreign investment rules. And as the COVID-19 pandemic puts the country at heightened risk of strategic takeovers by aggressive foreign actors like China, so the suggestion has also been made that potential takeovers by Chinese state-owned enterprises in particular could be used on behalf of the Communist Party of China to advance its foreign strategic interests. So over the short and long term, could you expand on what you believe are the foreign strategic interests of the Chinese government? What are the risks to Canadian assets? And should we impose a complete moratorium on these investments, or at the very least significantly strengthen the national security provisions of the ICA?
Thank you very much for that question, Deputy Dreeshen. Yes, I think that is an accurate statement that I tweeted out. And let me start by saying to explain a little bit about how the Chinese economy works and their strategic investment objectives, which plays into this. They basically every year they get given a list of prioritized sectors, and right now they have let's say 9 sectors, I believe, which are prioritized, and we see these sectors get vast sums of money to invest abroad and invest domestically. And the sectors that we see being prioritized are politically motivated sectors. And we see this fundamentally in the performance of the firms. Believe it or not, Chinese firms, especially the SOEs, have very low return on assets and equity, some of the lowest in the world. The Chinese stock market, large caps are yielding about 1% annually for the past, let's say, 25 years. And then we also see this in how capital is allocated within the country and abroad. Just as a simple example, they have prioritized sectors like big data and facial recognition primarily for domestic security concerns. And so when they are talking about things like artificial intelligence at the University of Toronto and some of the other highly skilled areas, they're using that technology in ways that liberal democracies might not appreciate. So even if it is not necessarily a purchased firm necessarily where the jobs are relocated out of Canada, at the very least it probably bears a second look at what some of these Chinese companies are doing, especially with the technological resources and how they are being used in places like Xinjiang. How Chinese companies are investing abroad, we see very clear examples where, for instance, they will work through venture capital firms to access the technology of a target firm and gain access to its technology, and then either copy that technology, license the technology. There's many different patterns that this is taken, so that technology can then be essentially exported to China and used there. We've seen examples in the United States and other countries where they have not submitted for a national security review. So I think we see that this is the behavior that we're dealing with, that when we talk about a rules-based order and the standard economic practices that we take for granted is not something that China abides by typically.
Well, thank you very much. I see that the yellow card has come up. I was going to ask Mr. Balsillie similar questions about his concerns about state-owned enterprises legislation that we believe is necessary, but we'll have to leave that for another question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Assassi. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to each of the witnesses. I found today's testimonies very informative. Now, if I may start off with Mr. Balding. Mr. Balding, on several occasions during the course of your testimony, you have made it known that you're not too familiar with the Investment Canada Act. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, yes.
And as I understand, having listened to you, you're concerned about predatory action by Chinese state-owned enterprises, correct? And I think you consistently emphasize that these SOEs are attempting to avoid scrutiny insofar as their investments are concerned. So all that to say, the Government of Canada, the Department of Industry, released a statement on April 18th. I'll read it out to you and you tell me whether there's any way that those SOEs could avoid scrutiny. It says here, the government will subject all foreign investments by state-owned investors, regardless of their value, to enhanced scrutiny. So does that, put some of the concerns you have highlighted to rest?
Thank you for that piece of information. And actually, it does not really, and let me explain why. In China, a state-owned enterprise is a very specific incorporation classification. It's like LLC, partnerships, things like this. SOE is a very specific form of
But
incorporation.
Mr. Balding, but the national security provisions in the Canada Investment Act, those can be used. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes, and so here's what I'm leading up to. So there are many companies that do not qualify as state-owned enterprises that are also first of all acting at either the behest or are.
But Mr. Balding, even if that were the case, even if, let's say, for whatever reason, the government is not aware that this is essentially a state-owned enterprise, there are national security provisions which allow you to look at every single investment. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes, I've learned that today. I was just. Okay.
So if you'll allow me now, if I could turn to Mr. Wakil. Welcome, Mr. Wakil. I know that you have an abundance of experience. You've been one of the most distinguished practitioners in this area. And your view is that our Investment Canada approach has been very intellectual property could fall in the wrong hands. Does the Investment Canada Act provide adequate protection?
I think I only caught the last bit of that question. My apologies. I had audio difficulties.
My apologies.
Mr. Asasi, can you please repeat the question? You were cutting out. I've stopped the clock, so if you could repeat that question, please.
Sure. Mr. Wakil, I know you're very experienced in this area, over 20 years, I would say, but Mr. Balsillie has identified a real concern about intangible assets and intellectual property and things of that nature. Do you think that the Investment Canada Act, as it's currently constituted, does protect against the acquisition of intellectual property assets?
I share Mr. Balsillie's concerns that there are gaps in the legislation. I think the legislation as it's currently drafted does a very good job with respect to the monitoring of acquisitions of controls of Canadian entities. I think in certain instances, there may be jurisdictional scope for an acquisition of an intellectual property asset to be caught by the Investment Canada Act and reviewed by it. But I think it would be worthwhile to do exactly what Mr. Balsillie says and think about whether or not there are any gaps. And I think that there are arguably gaps with respect to its scope, and that is with respect to transactions that do not involve acquisitions of control or acquisitions of ownership interests in other entities or assets. And there can be situations where technology transfers undermine national security, but they're not caught by the jurisdictional scope of the Act. So I do think the Act does a great job. And my response to the question that the committee is considering in these hearings with respect to whether or not there ought to be threshold reviews or whether or not there ought to be moratoriums is that the Act doesn't need to be changed. With respect to non-COVID specific issues that are broader in nature, should we reevaluate periodically the Act and whether or not it needs to be upgraded? Yes, I do. I think we should.
And very briefly, Mr. Balsillie, the concerns you've raised, I just wonder, do you want to see changes, all of these changes in the Canada Investment Act framework, or are some of the things that you're concerned about, can they be addressed outside the Canada Investment Act?
No, the ICA has to be profoundly revisited for the nature of the contemporary economy.
Thank you.
And our next round of questions goes to MP Patzer. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to start with Mr. Balsillie here. I want to go back to what you told us a few weeks ago, and I'll start with a quote. We have to be honest about the degree to which our policy community has been captured by foreign interests. A sovereign Canada is not their job and not what they're interested in. So we have to be very cautious about the degree to which foreign companies have captured the regulatory mechanisms and policy making of our country. I see it every day, end quote. So we're studying this closely now. So what
So could you get a lot more specific on these points? And what all are you seeing from foreign companies and policymakers that works against our sovereignty?
Well, what I see is our policymakers inviting foreign companies to take our sovereignty and prosperity away. That's why I said in my comment that we're talking about a second bolt on the front door while we advertise the screen door and the side is open. So we have no effective policies for the nature of a contemporary economy. And I think you could begin by creating a list of strategic technologies, which every advanced country is doing. The US is under a revisiting of that right now in key sectors to their economy. We have not done that. They list the technologies, they list the companies, they list the researchers, and they review it very, very carefully. Then they have a comprehensive spillover framework so that the nature of any investment is taken through the lens of the nature of the spillovers for how these technologies work. I would say those are two steps we should have done 20 years ago.
Okay, the government has talked about enhancing scrutiny under the ICA for public health and critical goods and services. There are areas which should be considered critical, but the government is not declaring or treating them as such. So A, does it make sense to define our energy sector and agriculture as critical? And would that include oil and gas?
I would say you have to look at the nature of the technologies that have economic and non-economic effects because of the cross-cutting nature of it. So I wouldn't say agricultural broad or energy is broad, but I would say aspects of renewable energy, aspects of clean agriculture, aspects of AI that applies to those. If we want to be sovereign and secure in those realms and prosperous in those realms, then you have to define the specific technologies and the spillover structures. And I've laid out a framework which is rather straightforward and convention by innovation economists globally and other nations. I would just suggest we adopt what others do.
Okay, so but being industry specific though, like are there any other industries which may or may not be considered critical that should be protected per se though? In the Canadian interest?
Well, we could look at the U.S. is right now studying this week water treatment and sanitation. Next week, they're studying emerging financial fintech. Last week, they did AI and quantum. Do we know who's the leading holder of quantum technologies in Canada? Do you know how many patents they hold? Would they hit our threshold? The week after, they're doing space and space technology. So have we done any of these exercises for any of our sectors that affect us economically and non-economically? And I'm deeply involved in these files, and the answer is no.
Okay, thank you. For Mr. Balding here, there are concerns about the vulnerability of our natural resources, which the government doesn't seem to care about developing in the first place to foreign acquisition. But I also want to bring up the upcoming shift to 5G. Canadians were already worried about Huawei before the COVID economy, but now we have to consider it even more. You've mentioned that China has a list of targeted sectors. How likely does that include our communications companies? And would there be a subtle or indirect methods of a takeover?
They absolutely have a lengthy list of not just companies, but also specific intellectual properties that they're interested in. And they use a variety of methods. For example, even though we're using Zoom, China has basically the underlying technology in Zoom is used widely with Chinese companies and is going to essentially flow over the same exact network. So even if you were to leave Zoom, there are Canadian companies using basically the same underlying set of code that is going to take that communications through China. So it's not just direct investment takeovers. There's many channels through which China seeks to obtain that level of interest, and telecommunications would be a key sector for them.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm pretty much at the end of my time, so I'll see the rest of what I have.
Thank you very much, MP Patzer. And the next round of questions goes to MP Johari. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and once again, welcome all the witnesses to our committee. Very, very informative. Mr. Borselli, I'm going to focus all my 5 hours, 5 minutes on asking questions. I wish it was 5 hours. 5 minutes on exploring the IP and exploring the contemporary economy that you talk about, and the IP and the big data. As I was prepping for the meeting, I was looking at the number of applications that has been submitted and the dollar value and the threshold, etc. But nowhere I could find the number of IP associated with these investments. And when I look at the $428 million in asset, I was trying to get a definition of the asset. Does the IP include the asset or not? And I was looking at whether, depending on the different state order organization, whether it's 1.6 billion or it's 1.07 billion. And I'm thinking about, I come from a management consulting background. I work with a lot of Fortune 500 as well as small businesses. Most of our IP, and even most, if you look at the government of Canada, the industry department, we are spending $2.2 billion scaling up organizations. And these guys come with a lot of IP. I could not find any indicator saying the number of IPs that's going to foreign investment or foreign countries. Regardless, I know most of our investment is going to US, close to 60% or 54%. The rest is going to EU at 24%, 5% in China. But I could not get any data around the IP. Do you have some data around where our IPs are going?
Well, yes, there was a recent IRPP study that basically says the overwhelming proportion of the Canadian IP is leaving the country. And WIPO had a recent report we're the only large AI country that's had a decline in patents filed in the last 3 years. And Canadian taxpayers fund for 20 years foundational AI IP that's transferred to Google without any review. And Google has said it's in all their products and worth billions dollars a year in their profits. And we have 17 of our top researchers in strategic telecommunications working with Huawei with no form of strategic review, both in the research funding or in our ICA. So I said, we have a big screen door at the side with a sign that says, please enter here. Yeah. And, we're talking about another bolt on the front door.
What would change in the short term, and what would we change in the long term? Because you're talking about updating a new framework, and we need to update it. We need to update it immediately, and we need to bring IP and big data into it, which I agree 100%. What can we do in the short term? As an amendment, as a recommendation, and in the long term?
As I said, in the short term, the two things you should do right now is create a list of strategic technologies and review them, just like other nations have been doing throughout 2019 and 2020. And the U.S. is working through specific sectors right now, and it's all on the web. And second of all, I would have an updated framework that codifies the effects for what they really are, not just some kind of arbitrary dollar level, and not kind of jobs when it's a reshuffling of jobs for sectors that have zero or negative unemployment. So
the government has tabled about has identified 6, let's say, sectors, or what we call them tables, and added recently 2 more around food and around distribution as well as the health. Isn't that sufficient as a tool to use, or do we need to further modify that? Like, what would be a strategic technology to you that is not covered under the Act?
I'm deeply aware of what those tables are doing, and in no way, shape, or form have they looked at this kind of role for purposes of protecting us from a national strategic point of view based on our geostrategic realms for investment in technologies. Put that in their mandate. That's fine. And then they'll come back and say the very same thing. Create a list of technologies and sectors that matter. Create a framework that you evaluate it, and make sure that it's only
Perfect.
It's a proper approach
with
for most.
30 seconds to go, can you give me the top 3 that you recommend? Should
technologies? Oh, I think without a doubt, AI and quantum should be in it. Without a doubt, other things like telecommunications that go with it. Renewable energy, all of biomedical and biotechnology, emerging fintech and space technology. They happen to be the Americas doing also.
Regardless of the threshold, regardless of the asset, regardless of the benefit, any organization that has an IP in that area should be considered for a review.
100%.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Notre prochain tour, c'est député Lemieux.
MP Lemieux, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My question will be for Mr. Wakil. You mentioned in your opening remarks that the possibility of changing it in the long term, the law that is. But in order to change it, you have to understand it and comprehend it. For that, we need transparency. Would you agree to open up the archives, particularly ministerial decisions that have been taken in the past, so that we can judge the effectiveness, so we can understand the weaknesses or the shortcomings of the system? Would you be agreeable to that kind of move?
That would involve the ex post review of investments to.
My apologies, Mr. Wakil. Can you?
Pardon me.
Thank you.
Sorry. I would be agreeable to a proposal to engage in an ex post review of investments to measure the effectiveness of the Investment Canada Act. With respect to the specific proposal to or suggestion to open the archives, I would hesitate to do that. There are statutory protections for the confidentiality of information that investors have provided to the government in the context of their reviews. I think it would, an opening of the archives would risk breaching those statutory provisions, and investors take great comfort in the fact that their sensitive business information will be treated confidentially in the context of a review. So some form of review to assess success or failure, I think, should always be welcomed and endorsed. But the specific opening of the archives, I would not recommend.
Néanmoins, ce qu'on constate.
But at least we could all agree that the minister doesn't have to provide any accountability right now, and it would perhaps be a great contribution to transparency in general.
The prior response.
La question était plus dans.
Well, today, should there be greater transparency on the part of the minister for the decision he or she takes?
I don't think that there is a urgent need for greater transparency with respect to net benefit reviews, with respect to national security reviews. Per my prior statement, I think it would be helpful, as we have experience with the national security review regime, to consider, for the government to consider whether or not additional case-specific disclosure would be possible in order.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for that round. We will now move to MP Massé. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Part of the challenge we have right now is the fact that the Investment Canada Act was changed in 2013 under the Harper administration through a budget bill. So what that meant was that there was no committee undertakings with regards to this as a specific file. In fact, in the subsequent parliament, I had a motion to do just that that didn't come to fruition as well, too. And so what that means is that we never had a robust discussion nor an opportunity to discuss the intricacies and also the changes necessary for updating. In fact, we see the threshold go up in 2017 to $1 billion. All this was done with zero public input with regards to an actual bill and zero consultation open in a democracy. To Mr. Balsillie, can I ask you, do you think that there would be, an interest from stakeholders in various sectors to actually now participate in a more wholesome review of the legislation, given the fact that even when we talk about the review that was done in 2013, prior to that, it was decades before there was anything meaningfully done on this bill?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, the stakeholders are Canadians, and so the most important thing is to understand what we need to be prosperous and sovereign in a changed world. And so, of course, and that's why I talk about public goods versus private interests. That you have externalities or spillovers that aren't priced in an individual's decision. That's why I mentioned the computer engineer who may take a job with an SOE in Germany, but that may hurt, and that's good for him because he or she gets a raise, but it hurts the country overall. And I know very directly that those that are administering these policies are looking for political direction on this. So it has to be a lens of the country, not a specific sector, because they'll just look after their narrow private interests, not the broader externalities or spillovers.
Real quickly to Mr. Crane, Wakil, and Mr. Balding, were you consulted at all during the 2013 changes? If you could just say yes or no, I know that my time's up after that.
Yes, and in fact, I appeared before this very committee in 2013 to discuss the changes to the SOE.
That was in the context of the budget bill, yes.
Thank you very much. We will now start the third round, and our first questions go to MP Rempel-Garner. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I will put on the record that Conservatives are supportive of the motion which Mr. Erskine-Smith moved. We are particularly interested in the context in which that decision was made, given that the Liberal government did allocate $12 million to Loblaws for refrigerators in the last Parliament, I believe, or earlier this year. We're also interested in the working conditions that frontline workers would have been subject to during the COVID crisis, and it will be a great conversation, and we hope that we also would have representation from workers with regard to that study. So we will be supporting that motion. So Mr. Balding, I'm going to start by directing some questions to you. By way of context, I'll give you 2 pieces of context for the study that I've found as a legislator to be interesting. First of all, Canada is unique, as all countries are, but we don't have the same levels of large-scale capital that other countries might have access to, broadly speaking, in terms of the ability to capitalize up big, let's say, natural resources plays. So often we look to FDI for that type of investment. The second piece of context was my experience in trying to find witnesses for the study. And I think that there's, between 5 different areas, there may be conflict or a desire to keep the status quo. The first would be, when I think about the amount of money that comes from mergers and acquisitions related to state-owned or state-influenced enterprises from authoritarian countries. That's a big piece of business in the Canadian legal community as well as in the Canadian banking community. Then I also think about Canadian universities, where there is a propensity for university administration to attract students from authoritarian countries, given that they pay our universities a lot of money to go there as international students. But also my background is in, prior to politics, in intellectual property management and sponsored research at various Canadian universities. And there is a push to participate in various sponsored research contracts with either authoritarian governments or state-owned or state-influenced enterprises from those countries. And then, of course, our government right now is in the middle of a very significant push to secure a UN Security Council seat, which has its own politics associated with it. So I find that there's a propensity to not talk about this. It's like let's just ignore everything and hope that that the status quo maintains. So I'm just wondering, given that you do sort of sit outside those baskets of potential conflict, if you could point us as legislators to other countries or perhaps other witnesses that might not be tainted by those particular glasses that might help us with our deliberations on how to move forward.
So the question, as I understand it, is who are witnesses that I could refer you to that would not be tainted by those glasses? Specifically,
sure, or best practices internationally as well too, that we could be deliberating upon.
Yes. So absolutely, I'd be more than happy to get you a list of people that would be able to speak to that and have experience with countries like Canada and some of the unique characteristics. I think I can refer you to some people, and I'd be more than happy to exchange emails or something like that and come up with a list of people that I think would be able to answer that specific set of questions, as you said, people that weren't in those specific boxes or weren't hindered by.
Thank you. With the last few seconds that I have left, I'll turn to Mr. Balsillie. I want to go back to the point I made about Canadian universities. And, you know, we have wonderful universities here, but this is kind of a touchy, taboo topic. How much do you think Canadian universities are compromised by a desire to attract international students and R&D funding, sponsored research funding from authoritarian countries?
In my experience, the consideration is getting their research advanced and getting their work published, and the lens of national security or national prosperity is not their responsibility. That's the responsibility of the funder, which is the government, to provide guidance on that. And currently that's absent.
Okay, so you're saying that the marriage point there is looking at this lens from the perspective of the government's fiduciary responsibility in allocating tax dollars to universities who might be in this situation.
Correct.
Thank you very much. Just a message to Professor Balding with respect to the list requested by MP Rempel-Garner. If you can forward that list to the clerk, he'll make sure that it is distributed. Thank you so much. And with that, we will move to MP Lambropoulos. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all of our witnesses for being here with us today to answer our questions. And so my first question is going to go to Mr. Wakil. In the Investment in Canada Act, the concept of national security is not explicitly defined so as to give some leeway to the Minister of Innovation, Industry and Science, as in consultation with the Public Safety Minister, to flag or review any of the investments that seem to be a threat to Canadian security, that seem to be injurious to Canada. Given this, do you think that the flexibility and the fact that it's not clearly defined has some negative consequences on our security? Do you think that there should be at least some lower limit that people need to guide themselves by, considering that governments change and that different ministers are responsible at different times?
I think it's important to have flexibility, and I think it's difficult to balance the need for flexibility versus the need for certainty. And I think the government has tried to do a good job in balancing that over the last couple of years since the National Security Review regime was introduced. The Act, as you say, doesn't have a definition of national security. It's issued guidelines with respect to what national security can include. It's provided disclosure in its annual reports about the sorts of cases that it's reviewed under the National Security Review regime, the countries of origin of the investors, the industry sectors that it's investigated. And I think that sort of disclosure is good and helpful and useful to us. I think incremental change would be better. Incremental change would be useful. That is to say, enhanced disclosure of specific cases, more disclosure along the lines that we've got as the government gets more experience with the National Security Review regime would be helpful and desirable. Do I think wholesale change is needed? No, I don't. I don't think that the government should say, here's the list of 10 things that are national security and will always be national security. And that's an exhaustive list. I think that it should continue along the path that it's on, just continue down that path.
And you mentioned in your testimony that you are quite happy with the way that the Act is written and with how the government is handling it as it stands. Would there be any recommendations that you think would strengthen the security while still allowing us to benefit from foreign investment?
Yeah, I do think the Act is, generally speaking, well written. I think it covers a lot of transactions, a lot of foreign investment acquisitions, virtually all. Where I think there is a potential gap is in some of the areas that I think Mr. Balsillie has been talking about, which is with respect to technology transfers. And so, for example, if you acquire a company that has sensitive IP, that is subject to review. If that company enters into an agreement with a foreign entity to transfer that IP to the foreign entity, that's not subject to review. The effect is the same. The foreign buyer, foreign entity, has control of the IP or has access to the IP, but one type of commercial arrangement is subject to review and scrutiny, and the other type of commercial transaction or commercial arrangement is not subject to review and scrutiny. So I think I think it would be prudent to look at the legislation to see whether or not there are gaps that can be filled, like the one that I just gave by way of example.
Thank you very much. Mr. Balsillie, I think you've made your point clear on what you believe the changes that are need to be made. But do you think that there is that by imposing the changes that you have, we would be not necessarily benefiting, and we would be perhaps alienating foreign investors and not allowing them to be attracted to Canada?
Not the right kind of investors you want, because FDI in tech is principally extractive, and that's why our productivity has declined or stayed flat for the last 20 years in innovation, while the rest of the world has soared. So we're manufacturing our own decline, and we don't want that kind of investment. And so absolutely not. And there's very important to draw a distinction where Canada needs, there was a statement, somebody said Canada needs FDI for a strong economic recovery. Certain kinds of FDI will erode our recovery. And you have to draw a distinction between the natures of it. So it needs that basic piece of nuance.
That's my time, I believe. So thank you very much to our witnesses once again.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Rempel-Garner. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm just going to pull up something here. Sorry, 1 second. As has been mentioned somewhat during testimony today, some witnesses have alluded to the fact that we really don't have a timely way of knowing if takeovers are happening unless a publicly traded company has had to tell its investors until the takeover is finalized. So that's a feature that's somewhat unique to the Canadian system, I would think. I'm just wondering, Professor Balding, if you wanted to speak at all to the principle of transparency in terms of any sort of review framework that countries around the world have implemented in terms of having some awareness or public awareness of what is happening with regard to state-owned enterprises or state-influenced enterprises investment in countries, and it, particularly if you'd want to speak to best practice as well too.
I think two specific issues. I think the United States was addressing these very same issues roughly, I think 1 or 2 years ago, 18 months maybe, and they basically found themselves at a very similar point where they had discovered a significant number of transactions either in minority stakes or, as Mr. Balsillie has alluded to, and I believe Mr. Wakil also alluded to, technology licensing, various things like that, which were designed to avoid review. And even in the United States, it was basically on the honor system. So that foreign investments were submitted by the acquirer for review, and so they basically reviewed that system, found a lot of the same gaps that I'm hearing today. And they basically tightened up in a lot of the same ways. So whether it was licensing of sensitive technologies, whether it was minority stakes, whether it was through things like venture capital funds that would take stakes through third parties. So I think a lot of the tightening and I would agree with the fellow witnesses, Mr. Balsillie and Mr. Wakil, I think there's probably gaps in tightening that should be used. And I think specifically in the case of China, we need to make sure that it's not simply state-owned enterprises, but whether the state has a stake or whether it's a state-linked firm like Huawei, which is not technically state-owned but is in reality state-owned. So there's a lot of definitional issues around what exactly is state-owned.
I think we're struggling with that in Canada as well too. I'm hearing the lexicon changed more towards state-influenced. The that seems to be a definition that could be perhaps more tightly defined and used. I guess I would also switch to you, to your knowledge of enforcement best practice. So for example, if there, and broadly speaking in Canada, without going into technical specificity, if there are conditions put on an approval of a takeover, there's really limited enforcement capability within our legislative framework right now, and I think that it might encourage bad actors, right? Or it's basically like, well, if so what, might be the outcome. Could you speak at all to, in terms of anything in terms of best practice on tightening enforcement if there are conditions placed on investment, if there's any other jurisdictions in the world that we should be looking to in terms of best practice to strengthen that aspect of our legislative framework?
I think most of the European countries that I have dealt with regards to Chinese investment, they're probably at a very similar point. Most of them are reviewing their investment practices, and this is a debate in Europe. In the United States, where we see this, there have been a couple of transactions, for instance, where Chinese purchasers either began to make the acquisition, and it's debatable whether or not they expected it to fall apart, but they got access to sensitive technologies and then walked away or decided not to submit in one case. And then in another case, there was a forced divestment because if the gay dating app Grindr, which basically had exposed users around the world to this data to Chinese government users, and so these are questions I think honestly everybody is dealing with, and there really isn't, for these specific issues, there are not best practices that I know of because there's still relatively new issues globally.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Longfield. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for the testimony today. I want to start off my questioning on a theme around trade with Mr. Crane. Very interested in your testimony around the need for international trade and investment. Looking at the idea of having a temporary moratorium or having a moratorium on SOEs, and what that might mean in terms of the signals that we're giving in terms of wanting to be a trading nation, whether you have any comments on that.
I do. Thank you very much, Mr. Longfield. One of the risks of having blanket rules is that we don't always see what the unintended consequences of those rules might be. For example, Canada is still quite reliant on other countries for PPE equipment, and we are cooperating with other nations to develop vaccines and treatments for COVID-19, which is not just affecting Canadians, but affecting citizens from around the world. And I will note that the government did announce a research partnership with a Chinese company to work on developing the COVID-19 vaccine in Canada. And my concern is that if we impose blanket restrictions on investment, maybe we don't benefit from those opportunities, and we impact our ability to work cooperatively with other countries on goals that are mutually shared. I don't disagree with Mr. Balsillie that there are areas where we need to have heightened scrutiny and where we should be focused on protecting critical industries and critical technologies. But having blanket restrictions does send the wrong message to the world that Canada, is not open for business, and we need to collaborate with other nations to achieve common goals.
Thank you. I had a Zoom meeting earlier this morning with the All-Party Health Research Caucus, in which we had scientists from across Canada talking about the importance of sharing information in order for us to attack a global pandemic together. And there will be a global recovery that we have to attack together. I think we're much more connected than we even realize through the unintended consequences. So maybe a quick follow-up on that would be what we have in our act right now. That we have a national security review, of course, and it's open at this point in terms of interpretation, which gives us some flexibility. And then we have the net benefit review. Do you see any need to change either portions of that within the Act?
It's a great question. The Investment Canada Act is actually working quite well at the moment, and it does cover, at least on the national security side, the vast majority of investments in Canada. I do agree that there are situations that may not be covered by the Investment Canada Act. But even situations where a company would acquire an important piece of technology could be considered a reviewable national security investment under the right circumstance if that asset was important and an important part of a company's business. So, the Act does cover that. And, to another point that was raised earlier, there is no evidence that companies are avoiding filing notifications under the Investment Canada Act. Foreign investors that come to Canada don't know the rules here and will work closely with legal counsel and with advisors to make sure that when they do invest here, they're given guidance on how to comply with Canadian law. And in my experience, investors are actually quite cautious about making sure that they do comply with the law. And so in my experience, investors will submit filings to the government to advise them of a transaction. And where the government has expressed concerns, they don't hesitate to let us know. And that commences quite a lengthy and detailed investigative process that, as I mentioned, can take upwards of 200 days to complete, which is twice as long as the process in the United States.
Right. And the companion legislation of the Corporations Act, you still have to follow the law even after investment. And there's ways of handling that if you don't.
Correct. And the Investment Canada Act also provides extensive penalties for investors that do not comply. They can be forced to sell their investment at no minimum price. There are fines of $10,000 per day for each violation. And that's in addition to all of the other provincial and federal rules that investors are required to comply with when they come to Canada.
Thank you for your balanced testimony. I really appreciate it. I think it's very good for our report to have both sides of the argument. And I'm on your side, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Longfield.
Back over to you.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to Député Lemire. Vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes et demie.
You have the floor for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. My question goes to Mr. Balsillie. Mr. Balsillie, I think that your testimony was one of the most relevant testimonies that we've had in this committee. I would like to go a little further, and I would like to hear your opinion about stakeholders in the Act. Last week, a witness told us that the Act should include stakeholders, consumers, the government, the environment, among others. Do you agree to modify the Act to include these stakeholders? And with your testimony today, should we also include patents and innovation?
First thing I'd like to say, Mr. Crane was characterizing my testimony as a blanket thing for all investments, and I was talking about a particular lens for the nature of the externalities and spillovers for technology, which is absent for the contemporary economy. And so what happens, and so, for MP Longford, I'm for Canada here, that when you look at these things, we've learned that technologies affect our health, affect our security, and affect our economy. And so when you interview stakeholders, the most important thing is this is supposed to be a public good, a net benefit test, where you look at the overarching effects of these things. And so you should interview many stakeholders, but ultimately you need experts to measure these various effects. And I've had considerable interplay with those who administer the ICA, and like Huawei is considered a Canadian company because it has a Canadian subsidiary, and they ask us to, voluntarily bring forward things if we're taking investment just because it might be a problem. And I'm deeply involved with a number of technology companies, and so people are making decisions on their narrow and specific interests, and it's up to our policy community to make sure that these are in our national interest.
Est-ce que vous seriez d'accord?
If you could give a quick answer, do you think that the Minister of Industry should be more transparent and be accountable when it comes to the decisions that he's making when it comes to Canada's benefits?
Comment on the benefit calculation. What I do know is the overwhelming majority of consequential transactions never cross his desk.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Massé. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I don't know who said it, but I know I just won a bet with the quote "not open for business" slogan. I had predicted with my staff that I would hear that today, and so I've won a Tim Hortons coffee, which is now going to benefit 3G Capital, which is in essence having Canada's iconic coffee maker has dropped from 13th to 67th in Canada's reputable companies, the biggest slide in history for that. But at any rate, I do want to actually give Mr. Balding, Professor Balding, a question here with regards to also even private equity firms are unknown investment options in terms of a review as well too. Should that be also a concern? Because there is a couple factors that we need to consider here is that Canadians, through either corporate tax cut reductions, direct subsidies municipally, provincially, or federally to acquire jobs, or even research and development grants and waivers of costs contribute to the economic growth and development of some of these companies in the jobs. And when they are taken over, if we're not knowing what we're getting into, whether it be China or other non-government democratic governments, is there also, a benefit to reviewing ownership that might come through another model?
I do think it would be reasonable to take in some of those third-party investors like VCs in tech or private equity and maybe more established firms, because that is clearly something that we've seen Chinese firms do is work through some of those third-party beneficiaries to disguise asset transactions. So I do think that would be a reasonable step in some way, whether it required changing legislation or just a regulatory change.
Yeah, and that's where we see maybe perhaps some other kingdoms and others that are involved in investments, because I think it's reasonable that when they go against some of our subsidized, even global initiatives, our investments undermine our own practices. So you think that's significant enough to worth a review as well?
Yes, and I think we've seen some of the changing practices that we've seen by companies like this in how China is changing through their investments and other practices, the overall conversation.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. That is the end of our third round, and we do have time to begin a fourth round. I understand that the Conservatives will split their time equally between the Bloc Québécois and the NDP. So with that, we will move to Député Savard-Tremblay. Vous avez 2 minutes et demie.
You have 2 minutes and a half. Thank you so much, Chair. Seeing as how we're sharing our time, if you could let me know when I'm midway through the time allotted to me rather than at the very end. I would like to put a question to Mr. Basile. You said when you were talking to my colleague, Monsieur Le Maire, you were saying that most transactions don't come across the minister's desk. Is there a mechanism whereby there would be a greater number of such transactions reviewed by the minister's office?
Yes, of course. If you had a list of strategic technologies that you reviewed and you had a list of the key actors that were involved in those technologies, and as part of their requirements that they notify you on indirect investments or certain licensing technologies that were mentioned or certain partnerships of research, then absolutely would come forward. But our current lens of framework, as I mentioned in my testimony, does not address the overwhelming majority of consequential transactions in the intangibles economy, which is 91% of the value of the S&P 500. And this is why we're at risk both for sovereignty, and this is why our productivity and prosperity has slid in the innovation economy in the last 20 years.
So then, you believe that we should reinforce transparency, correct?
If there's, I thought the questions on transparency was about evaluating and calculation of the net benefit test. And in that respect, I can't comment. But however, I do know that the overwhelming majority of relevant transactions never come forward based on the lens of the framework that's applied to this. And that was the nature of my testimony today, that you have to change your lens and your framework so that they surface, so that we properly understand and calculate the benefit or the issues for Canada economically and non-economically.
So then, that's pretty much what it boils down to. If we have more transparency, if we are tightening the criteria, and we're also getting more information available to us so that we can do our work, we're all the better for it.
Merci beaucoup.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our next 2.5 minutes will go to MP Massé.
Thank you. Mr. Wakil, now we were talking earlier, and I want to go back to that because I think it's with regards to the evidence that's out there in terms of measuring. I think it's a fair discussion about there isn't enough out there. How do we go about changing that? I think it is at some point logical to do some type of metrics related to when a company is purchased in Canada, in what patents or what types of innovation is then brought to our country from somewhere else, and then versus out of what's exited from the country. Is there any model out there that you're aware of and other countries doing? I think that's a fair way of evaluating. Otherwise, when we look at some of the historic companies that we've lost, we don't seem to go back and review whether what we're doing makes sense or not. And that's hence when we haven't had a comprehensive review of the Investment Canada Act. Wouldn't it be a logical thing to do to at least measure the success or failure of the model we have?
I think it certainly would be something that would be worth exploring to determine whether or not there could be a methodology developed that would give us an accurate assessment about whether or not the Investment Canada Act regime, at least in that benefit portion of the regime, has worked well over the years. I think a problem that we would have is one that I began to flag in my earlier comment, which is the but-for scenario, to the extent that, and that's a problem with the assessment of investments now. For example, the government's trying to predict the future. What is the likely 1, 2, 3, 4 years going to look like, and for the Canadian business, and how does that align with the investor's plans, and is that beneficial or not? Is there a benefit to proceeding with the transaction based on the likely future outcome of the Canadian business? And that's a very tricky and complicated assessment to make. We have a similar problem with respect to the ex post review of an investment that's completed. What would have happened if the investment hadn't happened? Do we have the information available? So conceptually, I think it would be worthwhile looking back and seeing whether or not it would be possible to construct a test to evaluate the success of the legislation. But I can see that there would be a lot of practical challenges with that.
Thank you. I know that I think I missed out of time, but it just seems really odd that we just have a shot in the dark process that doesn't have any type of empirical evidence afterwards when we know we can get some of those facts. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And our last round will go to MP Assassi. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you. For 5 or 2.5? For 5?
5.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Very grateful for that. Now, given that this is the last round of questioning, I think this is devoted to mopping up, and if there's been anything that I've had a hard time understanding, to clarify. So one of the members of this committee was suggesting that after having reviewed the annual report, they could not determine which one of those acquisitions had an element of intellectual property having been acquired as well. But Mr. Wakil, if I could go to you, I don't think it's the job of the annual report to clarify which acquisition involved IP and which one didn't. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes, you're correct. I mean, I would assume that most acquisitions would involve the acquisition of some degree of IP, and that would be a reasonable assumption to make. But no, that's not a requirement, the disclosure of whether IP
And so,
acquired or
and
not.
also that doesn't mean for a second that our regulators, our framework does not examine the intellectual property aspects of a company that's about to acquire, correct?
I agree with that.
Okay. And lastly, a quick question again. Do you know of any other regime by any OECD country which does list the IP assets that were required?
No, I don't.
Okay. Now, if I could go to Mr. Crane, same question, just so I can satisfy myself that I understand this. First of all, is it unusual that the annual report does not state what the intellectual property assets of each one of those companies was?
No, the annual report is meant to provide a summary overview of where investments are originating from and the value of foreign direct investment that's notified to the government each year.
Okay. And again, that doesn't mean that our regulators are not also reviewing intellectual property capital that could also be ensnared in an acquisition.
That's correct. And in my experience on all national security files, there's a request for a list of the target company's intellectual property, which is reviewed and assessed.
Okay. And last question, same question as the one I put to Mr. Wakil. Do you know of any regime by any OECD country where intellectual property assets are actually listed so anyone could go look at it and see if anything needed to be flagged?
I'm not aware of any, but Canada does have a public registry of patents, trade, and trademarks, which anybody can freely look up on the internet.
Okay, thank you for that. And now, Mr. Crane, I very much enjoyed your testimony. At some point, you did state that you think that perhaps our regime would benefit from improved notification.
Mm-hmm.
Could you actually unpack that for us? Given the safeguards that we currently have, if we wanted to make for an even more robust system, what would that notification requirement look like?
Sure. While my position is that the ICA regime is working well and investors are approaching the government pre-closing on a voluntary basis, we could look to the model that the Americans piloted in 2018 and adopted in February 2020, which required that certain types of investments regarding a specified list of critical technologies or critical infrastructure are notified at least 30 days before closing. And while my position is that the system is working well, that's a model that the committee may want to examine to make sure, A, that we are addressing the problems that Mr. Balsillie has identified, and B, to ensure that we act in a manner that's consistent with our most important trading partner, and there's harmonization and alignment between Canada and the US on foreign investment reviews.
Thank you for that, Mr. Crane. Mr. Wakil,
Mr. Assassi, my apologies. Could you put back your headset, please? Thank you. I'll pause the time for you.
Thank you. My apologies. Mr. Wakil, could you also comment on what, for lack of a better word, we could refer to as a regime that has preemptive notification? What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. It would be desirable to explore whether or not we should move to a mandatory pre-closing notification regime. I think we'd have to think carefully about how we implement that to make sure that there is no unfairness for different types of investors. For example, if there is a mandatory regime just for state-owned enterprises, but a non-mandatory regime for not state-owned enterprises, could that deter beneficial state-owned enterprise investment in Canada? At the same time, if there is an identified list of technology that or businesses that would be subject to a mandatory pre-closing notification regime, is that list sufficiently clear so that everybody knows that the rules apply to them? So I think that it is definitely worth exploring, but there are issues that we'd have to think carefully about.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. And that is our time for today. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. And of course, our clerk, our analyst, IT, and our interpreters, thank you so much for your assistance again today. And with that, I call this meeting adjourned.
Thank you very much.